So today we've invited our speakers, Dr. Alex Fornito, Dr. Michele Veldsman, and Dr. Amy Kucieski. So we're going to be going in that order, and I'd like to briefly introduce each of them, and then we can get started. So Dr. Fornito, sorry. Dr. Fornito completed his master's and PhD at the University of Melbourne before doing a postdoc at the University of Cambridge, and he's currently the Sylvia and Charles Viertel Foundation Senior Research Fellow and head of the Brain Mapping and Modeling Research Program at the Turner Institute for Brain and Mental Health at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Dr. Veldsman is a senior postdoctoral research associate in cognitive neurology and a junior research fellow at Oxford. After completing her PhD at the University of Cambridge, she joined the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health in Melbourne, and she's currently based at the Department of Experimental Psychology at the University of Oxford. And lastly, our third speaker is Amy Kucieski, who I actually have the pleasure of working with as her graduate student. So she grew up in rural Ohio and has had a very interesting path coming from a math background before going into neuroscience. So she currently runs the COCO lab, the Computational Connectomics lab at Weill Cornell Medicine and Cornell University in Ithaca, where we focus on using quantitative methods, including machine learning, to look at multimodal neuroimaging data. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started. And the format of this workshop will be that each speaker will present their component, so that'll be about 20 minutes, followed by a 10-minute Q&A. So with that, I'd like to ask Dr. Fornito to go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that introduction. I'll just try and share screen and get everything working. Whoops. All right, can everyone see that? Okay. Yeah, so thanks very much to the student and postdoc SIG for the invitation to speak. I think this is really a great initiative, and it's a real privilege to take part. By way of introduction, so I work at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, and the work that we do focuses mainly on connectomics, and I work with a pretty multidisciplinary team of around 25 people at different levels, ranging from honours and PhD through to senior postdoc. And I completed my PhD in about 2007, so I've been in research for a bit of time, and I thought today the brief was to talk about burnout and how to deal with it. So I thought I'd give my personal perspective really on what I've found to be useful in trying to maintain a reasonable work-life balance. And these are just things I've picked up through self-reflection, chats with colleagues and mentors, and a lot of trial and error. Now, I will begin with a disclaimer, and that is that me giving this talk is in no way a statement that I've got it all sorted out and I consistently maintain some kind of mystical nirvana of work-life balance. It's not a statement that I've researched this issue extensively and that I'm some kind of expert on it. My ability to balance work and life fluctuates just like everyone's, and it is something that I'm constantly working on. I remember during the final phases of my PhD, I was sort of working crazy hours, and over a long time, that really did have a kind of sustained and unhealthy effect on me. It sort of it took almost a year for me to learn after that to fully relax and engage and socialize again. And so that taught me to place more value on things outside of work and to be more proactive in how I manage my work-life balance. And this is something that I've become better at since I've gotten older, and I've got 2 kids under 6, and so that helps kind of limit my work time in many ways. But I mean, to get started, I guess we can all agree that we work pretty hard in science, and there's lots of different reasons why. One is that we're intrinsically motivated. So if you're working in science, generally you are either completing or have completed a PhD or MD or some other higher degree. And so there's an implicit selection mechanism in there that generally ambitious, motivated, hardworking, perhaps even slightly neurotic people tend to end up in this profession. And this self-selection also means that you end up competing with other ambitious, motivated, highly capable people. And so this not only inspires us to work harder, but it also means that we do need to work hard just to keep up. And on top of that, we're typically competing with these smart, hardworking people for scarce resources. You know, there's never enough funding in research. Job security is low, and you know, it places more pressure on us to sort of jump through all the hoops that different funding agencies want us to jump through in order to stay in the game. Another factor is that science is hard. You know, to really discover something new and useful about the world is really an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And even if you do it, it can take decades to try to convince other people to believe you if, you know, the history of big ideas is anything to go by. And so as a result, we often spend years in a dark room developing an idea, we execute a project, we write up the results, and we're going to notify the world. But before we do that, we ask some of the smartest people in the world to tear the idea to pieces. And so, you know, we've effectively signed up for a life of asking others to constantly tell us what we've done wrong. I mean, you know, for me, that's precisely what makes science so powerful, and it's kind of the magic of science. But at the same time, if you don't approach it in the right way, it can be a tough job and it can take a personal toll. And it does motivate us to work very hard to make sure we kind of surpass this high bar set by our peers. On the flip side, if you think about the incentive structures in science, it's almost like they're set up to be intentionally addictive. And so I think of it a lot like slot machines in a casino. You know, these are machines that are specifically designed to evoke addictive behavior. You know, they include these near misses and intermittent reinforcement schedules. You know, they give you just enough to keep you playing. In many ways, science is the same. You spend years plugging away, pressing the buttons, pulling the levers, getting rejections and setbacks. And then just when you're about to throw in the towel, you get a grant or a publication and your brain releases a bunch of dopamine and you think, oh, okay, I'll keep in this thing a little while longer. You know, I'm intentionally being a little bit facetious with the analogy, but I think it is true that science is an intrinsically gratifying pursuit, and there is a great thrill in discovering something new. And you know, we can sometimes overwork ourselves in order to keep chasing that thrill. Now, the last thing is that, you know, there's a lot that we're expected to do these days. You know, we need to be good scientists, and that means understanding our content matter better than anyone else. And that's hard enough, but we also need to be good statisticians and programmers, and some modeling expertise would help. And so would a bit of a kind of grounding in philosophy. We need to be good collaborators and mentors and public advocates for science. And we should also be influencers on social media. And we need to champion open and reproducible science, but we should also be good citizens in our institutions and sit on different boards and committees. And in our spare time, we need to do peer review, organize workshops and conferences, court philanthropic donors, and it's generally a good idea if we have at least one spin-off company. So, and yeah, on top of that, now with COVID, we do all this on the computer all day long with limited contact from our family and friends while we're homeschooling our kids. So, you know, we definitely have a lot of reasons to feel burnt out. The problem is that it can often be difficult to realize when we are starting to or beginning to burn out. Now, there's a lot of resources out there for trying to educate yourself. You know, this is one model that proposes different stages for how someone goes from a honeymoon phase with their work through to a kind of habitual burnout. And I show this not because I want to dwell on the details of the model. You know, the idea is that each stage is associated with different symptoms. And, you know, this is not generated through some wide-ranging systematic review of the literature. This was just simply one of the ones that came up on Google. And you know, I guess the point is that Google is your friend in this case. It is important to educate yourself about things like burnout and work-life balance, and there are a lot of resources on the internet to do that. I guess the tough thing is that even if you are aware of these signs, they can be hard to self-diagnose. So, you know, others might tell you that you're working too hard, but it's easy to brush it off as just a temporary thing. And friends might say that you seem irritable or edgy, but you can just put it down to a bad day or a week. And so, you know, the question is, how can you really gauge how you're doing? And, you know, for me, I kind of try to boil it down to something simple. And for me, it's really, I try to use my enthusiasm levels as a gauge. You know, I got into science because I love it. And so if I'm not waking up like this guy every morning, then, you know, that for me, that's a sign that I need to evaluate my priorities. Now, you know, not that I'm always like him all the time, but, you know, if you do have a persistent lack of motivation, or you feel like you've sort of fallen out of love with what you do, then that's a sign to reevaluate your priorities. In the short term, if you are feeling burnt out, you need, you know, for me, I would normally take a step back, take some time off, get some perspective, and develop a strategy to try to improve the situation. And that strategy has to be tailored to whatever your circumstances are. And this is where, you know, having a mentor can really help you develop a strategy. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And, you know, there's sort of what I think of as short-term fixes there. Once you're in an acute burnout, how do you kind of dig your way out of it? We can potentially talk about some of that in the Q&A, but today I want to talk about some longer-term strategies that, you know, I embed within my daily working routine that I find useful. They're simple, practical, and, you know, for me, they help me mitigate my risk of burnout. Of course, nothing is ever foolproof. So tip number one is always try to retain some perspective. You know, we've talked about how a career in science can be hard, and scientists do like to complain a lot. There's no shortage of reports in the media or other outlets bemoaning how hard a career in science is. You know, and Nature and Science frequently have articles that are telling us how hard careers in science are, and that it's okay if you want to leave, which is quite strange in a way. I don't know of many industries where the leading publication outlet actively encourages young members to leave the profession. You know, and so I'm not trying to deny the importance of what is covered in these. You know, absolutely there are serious structural issues in science and academia, and we need to do more to provide better pathways and security for ECRs. But being bombarded with these messages constantly in the media and scientific journals, at conferences and interactions with peers can really help lead to this feeling that we're in this uniquely cursed profession. And, you know, over an extended period of time, it can lead us to be overly pessimistic about our future prospects. So, you know, to gain a little perspective, I like to ask myself, well, is that true? Is science really a uniquely difficult profession? And, you know, I mean, like anything, it has its ups and downs. And, you know, for me, I like to compare myself to my friends in working in different professions. So I have friends working as lawyers who get paid well, but are really fundamentally unhappy with what they do. And I've also got friends in construction who can completely switch off when they finish work. Like once they get out of work, that's it. And it's fun time and they make the most of their free time. But, you know, they're really bored while they're at work, and they've got less job security. Often, you know, they're working on 3 to 6 month projects. You know, that's not to say that all lawyers and construction workers are miserable, but, you know, for me, it kind of brings me back to why I value a scientific career. And that's because that is that we have a lot of freedom. You know, we have the luxury of working on the things we want when we want, and that is really something that's quite rare. And, you know, I also have a lot of flexibility in my working hours, and that's a huge help with a family. So, you know, these are the things that I value in my professional life. For some of you, security may be more important. For others, it might be money, or, you know, something else. I guess the main point is try not to get pulled into all the negativity and the pessimism, and just focus on your own goals and values and what you want out of your career. If what you're doing now aligns with those, then great. But if it doesn't, then maybe it's time to think about a change. So tip number 2, don't tie your sense of self-worth up in the work that you do. So this may sound obvious, but a lot of people get caught in this trap, and it can be quite hard because science, you know, almost everything about science pushes us in that direction. You know, at a certain level, many people carry an implicit assumption that science is something that smart people do. And so if you succeed in science, then you're smart. And on the flip side, if you can't succeed, then that means you're not smart. And, you know, I mean, even people within science hold this view implicitly. You'd be surprised. Now, it should go without saying that this is not an accurate or a helpful view. Like anything, success in science depends on a complex combination of having a certain set of skills, one's own circumstances and personal history, and a lot of luck. And the other thing is that science also pushes us to constantly compare ourselves to others. So funding bodies and universities are obsessed with CVs and quantifiable metrics, and that implies that we can somehow compare our numbers to someone else's numbers, and that tells us how well we're doing. And it's very common, especially for ECRs, to kind of engage in this self-other comparison. Oh, Jane has got 3 Nature papers 2 years out of her PhD, and I've only got 1 paper in the Journal of Non-Significant Results, so that means I'm a failure. I'm not saying that we should live in a fantasy land and pretend that these things don't matter. Certainly if you're applying for a grant, and you do need to consider these things, and benchmarking yourself against applicants can be helpful to see how competitive you would be. But really, there's no fixed formula that defines success and where someone should be relative to their career stage. People have all sorts of career trajectories. Some start with a bang and then kind of fizzle out. Some have sustained success. Some start slowly and then really make a big impact. The best thing that you can do for yourself is really to focus on what you are doing right now and ask yourself, am I passionate about what I'm working on? Am I proud of what I'm working on? And really, these are the most important things. If the answer is yes to those 2 questions, then you are a success, because actually around the world, very few people are able to say yes to those 2 questions. Beyond that, beware of external awards and things. It's nice to get a H index of 100 or, get a Nobel Prize or whatever, but, don't set your career up to try to chase these things. You should derive intrinsic reward from what you do, and not search for extrinsic rewards, because it's a hollow pursuit. You can get very much caught up in this idea of, oh, if I just achieve X, then I'll be happy. But I guarantee once you get there, you'll find a way to discount that achievement, and then you'll find some other goal and you'll keep chasing that. And so you don't want to be the donkey chasing the carrot. It does sound a bit cliched and a little bit trivial, but you do have a lot of external pressures in science not forcing you, but really pushing you to derive your value or worth from all these external things. And you've got to bring it back to fundamentally, why am I doing this? What makes me happy? Is what I'm doing aligning with my personal goals? Tip number 3, maintain a deliberate diary. So by that, I mean that you really need to show your diary who the boss is and not let your diary control you. So instead of filling your time with random meetings and activities that just pop up and, oh, that sounds like a good idea, really think intentionally about how you structure your week and arrange things in a way that works for you. Now, there's lots of different time management strategies out there, and it's definitely worth looking into and choosing what would work for you. This is one simple scheme where you can define your tasks according to their urgency and importance. And so, for example, if something is urgent and important, then you should do it very soon. If something's urgent but not important, you can delegate, and so on. Another principle of effective diary management is learning to say no. Now, this is not an easy skill for a lot of us, myself included, but it is something that, like everything, you can develop. So when requests or opportunities arise, really think about how they align with your own goals. And if they're not mission critical, it is okay to say no. Now, I know that some of us might be scared to say no because we think it's rude, but personally, I find that if you respond to a request with honesty, it does go a long way. So something like, look, I'm sorry I can't do X. To be honest, I've really been struggling to maintain a healthy work-life balance, and I'm actively trying to reduce the number of things I'm working on at the moment. I can't help with this project right now, but I'll be happy to help you find someone that can. Responses of that sort, that are constructive, can allow you to free up time and, obviously not burn any bridges, or at least allay that concern that you might be rude to someone. Now, more generally, I think this quote from Steve Jobs really rings true. When he took over Apple for the second time, it was a company that was really over-diversified and struggling. And his solution was to reduce the number of products by 70% and just to focus on a few things done well. And, this was obviously instrumental in the dramatic turnaround of the company. I kind of feel, if he can do it with a multi-billion-dollar company, I'm pretty sure we could probably do it with our diaries. So you just need to be really frank and honest about your priorities and be disciplined about how you spend your time. Most importantly, in terms of executing discipline with your diary, you need to make sure that you schedule in recreation time each day. So I would recommend at least an hour where you should be doing something that is not related to work that you find pleasurable. So that could be exercise, meditation, sports, playing a musical instrument, collecting stamps, whatever it is. But you should do it religiously and protect that time each day. It's really important to stay connected to a sense of yourself outside of your work, and ensuring that you get some recreation time each day is really important for your mental health. You should also leave weekends free wherever possible. Now, that's not always possible. There might be a grant deadline, or maybe it's the final year of your PhD, or there's some other deadline and you have to put in extra hours, and that's fine. You go through busy periods, but you should return to a normal workflow once that's over. If you find that you're constantly giving up free time on a sustained basis, then that is a sign to just pause and reevaluate. Now, this can take a lot of discipline. We have a lot of pressures on us, and it's easy to just give up our leisure time to get things done. But if you can stay disciplined with that, it will pay off in the long run. Tip number 4, limit distractions. Again, something that would seem obvious, but something that a lot of us struggle with. I might be dating myself, but I can remember a time when there were no mobile phones or internet or social media. These are inventions that are optimized by very smart people to monopolize our attention, and so they're not going to help us use our time productively. Sometimes I see students working with Slack, Facebook, Twitter, email, text messages, all popping up while they're reading a textbook and coding up an algorithm and listening to music, and it's not going to help. So I would recommend assigning a specific time of day for dealing with emails, and it could be in the morning, at night, in the middle of the day, whatever. Just assign a specific time of day. Then switch off the alerts and use the rest of the time for work. And do the same for social media. You should only keep open the things you need to complete the task at hand. And the flip side is that you should switch off these alerts during your recreation time. I only have phone alerts for text messages. I couldn't think of anything worse than getting pinged every time for an email or some social media alert. And that really ensures that I've got a clear boundary between work and personal life, and that I'm not interrupted when I'm with family and friends. Final tip, very important, find a mentor and ideally an accountability partner. So you might be happy with your formal PhD and postdoc supervisor, but it's still a really great idea to try and establish a mentoring relationship with someone outside the lab. Now, this is someone who can provide an unbiased external opinion, whose primary interest is just making sure that you get the most out of your own professional life. A lot of people might ask, how do I find one? And I mean, the answer is simple. Just draw up a list of people that you respect in the field and shoot them an email. I know it can be intimidating, but you'd be surprised at how many people would be willing to help and how they would be flattered to think that someone else thinks that they're important and have something interesting to say. Really at the end of the day, the worst thing that they could say would be no. So there's potential for huge upside with really little downside. Now, the critical thing is to really be structured about the time you spend. So come in there organized with clear goals that you want to address, and develop plans and make sure that your mentor helps monitor your progress to implement those plans. You'll get out what you put in, right? And of course, there is also the OHBM mentoring program, which is a fantastic initiative, and your university or institute might have some as well. Now, it's also a great idea to have an accountability partner. So this could be someone even outside of science in your personal life. You know, you don't want this person to be someone where you just debrief and gossip and dump everything on. It would be, you know, again, you want to be structured about it, but if you do formulate a plan with specific actions, then that person can be someone that will hold you accountable. They can be someone that will call you on the day you said you were going to do something and say, well, did you do it? And make sure you do it. You know, I mean, improving things requires change, and a lot of us are not good at change. And so having someone else to hold us to account, make sure we don't face our challenges alone, and it can be a really powerful motivating force to make sure we actually do what we said we were going to do. And it's also a good way of getting external feedback on whether we're at risk of burnout. Now, there's a lot more that you could say about mentoring and accountability, which we don't have time to go into. Remember, Google is your friend. There's a ton of material on these topics. But, you know, I mean, I'd be happy to discuss anything further with anyone who's interested. So, you know, there's lots of other things I could say about work-life balance. You know, there's an entire self-help industry out there, and different things work for different people. I think the main thing is that, remember, if you get stuck, leverage the relationships around you. Speak to different people, get different perspectives, and choose options that work for you. And, you know, no matter how bad things get, remember that you wouldn't have gotten this far if you weren't a talented, resourceful person. So no matter what happens, you have the tools and abilities to land on your feet. You just need to believe in yourself and be ready to embrace change. As cliched as that sounds, that is the truth. Now, although it's very hard to set specific texts because different things appeal to different people. I can recommend this blog here by Natalia Bielchik. I've probably ruined the pronunciation, but she's written a lot about the ups and downs of academia and why she decided to leave. And she also led this article on self-management for ECRs published in Neuron, which is a really great starting point and a great resource. And of course, if anyone has any questions about any other things that I personally found helpful, you're free to reach out and get in touch at this email. But thanks for your attention.
Thank you. It was great doing the awkward applause.
I've got some sound. That's good.
Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put that in the chat. Otherwise, I can get started with one. So a lot of these tips that you presented, they're very helpful, so thank you for that. I wanted to ask, do you think these are all things that have stayed consistent throughout your career, or have you had different tips that you found more helpful, say, at your PhD stage, at your postdoc stage, as a faculty member?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, you know, early on a big problem for me, and I mentioned the idea that science can be addictive. And, you know, for me, I very much viewed it as a hobby. And so if I worked outside of hours, I think, well, it doesn't matter. I enjoy it. This is my recreation time. But, you know, over an extended period, then you have nothing else in your life. You don't have a sense of self outside of your work. And that is not helpful or constructive. And, you know, it took me a little while to realize that. And, you know, I was quite lucky to have great mentors. And so, you know, forming good mentoring relationships was something that's always been present. Gaining perspective is something that, you know, you always try to focus on, and something that, you know, I think as an ECR is particularly hard because your funding security is quite precarious. And I mean, I think this happens in any career, right? Like, a lot of young people enter some kind of profession and they have ambitions and goals, and they're not sure if it's all going to work out. And it's only once you've been through the rigmarole and you realize that things don't always work out the way you think, but actually it's not so bad anyway, that you kind of realize that, you know, things will turn out and you'll figure out a way no matter what happens. So, and the deliberate diary is something that has become increasingly important later on. You know, I think as you progress through your career, you get different demands, and it's about trying to juggle those. And so really starting to be intentional about structuring the diary and saying no is an active area of work.
Great, thank you.
There's some questions in the chat. And also just personally, thanks, Alex. There was lots of helpful stuff in there. Really enjoyed hearing that. So the question we've got from Mengzhai is, we get this pressure sometimes from our peers who seem to work from day through to night, non-stop. So how do we deal with that anxiety or that kind of, that, like you mentioned it, but comparing to what other people have, but there's almost this culture of work yourself to the bone, and how to break out of that trap?
I think it's a natural tendency, right? I think, human beings are machines that are designed to compare themselves to others. And so it takes self-discipline and, again, perspective to not get caught in that trap, right? Because I see it all the time, especially with ECRs. And, I was guilty of it too earlier on, where, you always think that someone else has got it all figured out. Like, oh, well, that person is just so brilliant, and, oh, they figured it out in half an hour and it takes me 3 days, or, oh my God, they can work so long. How do they do that? And, I guarantee you don't know what's happening in the life of that person. And I guarantee you that they've got their own insecurities and their own problems. We're all the same. And so that's what, when I say it takes discipline, I think for me, I always just try to return to the fact, I just try and sort of, basically put a block and say, no, it's not helpful. Let's focus on what I want. That person might work 120 hours a week, and, they might get 3 Nature papers and a Nobel Prize or whatever. But is that really what I want for my life? Do I need to, run that race? Or how do I want to spend my time? Actually, I want a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of that. Is what I'm doing right now allowing me to achieve all that? Just bring yourself back to what you actually want to do and how you want to structure your life. And once you focus on that, then you kind of you sort of divorce yourself from what's happening with other people's lives and schedules.
Thank you. I think you also sort of addressed a question from Hajir about the careerist mentality, and that's kind of the same thing of like deciding what it is you want. So yeah. Do you see hands up at all, Alicia, or should I continue with the chat questions?
I do not, but I know we're running a few minutes behind, so maybe we can do one more question and then we can leave the rest for the end if we have time.
Yeah, sure. Oh, it's a long one. Okay, tips on being, I'll pick a shorter one. Karen's asking tips on being disciplined and staying focused. So that was while we still have this flexibility at work. So yeah, I guess you've touched on a lot of things, but is there something, I guess, particularly when you're a PhD or early career researcher, and you don't have all those multiple demands that you really have to keep this strict diary, but you've just got a lot to get done? How do you foster?
Is the idea because you've got flexibility then, and you don't have a boss looking over your shoulder all the time, then you're tempted to play video games all day? Or is that... I'm
reading between the lines, we'll say yes.
I mean, I think that again does come down to your own intrinsic levels of motivation and whether you're happy doing what you're doing. For me, I've always been quite happy, thinking about and working on the ideas that I've worked on. And I've found that intrinsically motivating. And so, I haven't struggled to, spend my work time on those things. If you feel like you're not really motivated to get up and, do your PhD, then, it might be time to evaluate, is this topic really for me? Is this really what I want? And have an honest discussion with your supervisor about that. Now, I'm not saying that you're not going to have your bad days. And, certainly a PhD, you're going to have your ups and downs, but if it is happening for a sustained period of time, it is something it is one of those moments where you think, okay, maybe I need to reevaluate. At the same time, it is perfectly fine to just take a day off if you don't feel like it, and not beat yourself up about it. That can often be quite refreshing.
Great, thank you very much. That was very helpful. So with that, we'll move on to Michele. And if we have more questions or time for questions at the end, we can do that as well. Thank you.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep.
For some reason, it's not letting me advance. 1 second. Okay. So thank you to the SIG for inviting me to talk about my experience balancing work and family life as an early career researcher. I was a couple of years ago chair of the OHBM student postdoc SIG, and it's been one of the best experiences I've had with the committee. So it's really nice to be here to talk to you. So there's three main things I want to talk about today, which is this very common question of when is a good time to have kids whilst on the academic career path. And it's a question that I asked myself and that I hear a lot. I also want to ask whether we should be asking ourselves this question, and should we really be adapting our personal choices to academia, or should academia be adapting to us? So I've got a couple of disclaimers like Alex did. I want to acknowledge, first of all, this idea of survivorship bias. And quite often when we look to people for their successes, you know, we forget that there's a lot of people who haven't necessarily been able to get over those hurdles and barriers. And so by talking to people who are so-called successful or who've managed to overcome those barriers, we forget about all of the things that might have stopped a lot of other people. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Oh, I don't know what's going on with my slides here. So this is an image looking at the career paths of early career researchers in the UK. And as you can see, actually very few people do end up going into permanent research staff positions or professorships. And so survivor bias is actually a very real thing in academia. The second thing I want to acknowledge is my privilege. So probably my race and my gender hasn't really given me that many privileges, but it is true that I am in a dominant group and in many other ways. And so undoubtedly there are things that I have been able to get that other people haven't. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that, because things might be very difficult or different for other people. And certainly a lot of what I've had is because of this privilege and because of luck to a certain extent as well. So with all that in mind, I'll just take you a sort of brief overview of my career so far. I started with an undergraduate degree in experimental psychology from the University of Bristol. After that, I went to get some lab experience, mainly learning MRI at the Duke NUS Medical School in Singapore. I then did an internship, followed by a research assistantship, followed by a PhD at the University of Cambridge. My first postdoc working in stroke research was at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health in Melbourne. And then I came back to the UK and did 2 postdocs at the University of Oxford, where I still am. So in terms of my productivity, this is the kind of traditional measure, I guess, the number of publications. I've actually left the numbers off of the scale because, as Alex was mentioning, we have a tendency to compare, and I don't think it's useful and it's really not relevant. The main thing of relevance is the fact that I had a certain number in 2017, that number's back up again, but you can see this little dips here, which is of course my maternity leave. So my productivity took a hit, and that I think is one of the big anxieties that people have when it comes to planning to when to have kids in their academic pathway. So when is a good time to have kids on the academic pathway? Assuming, oh, for some reason we can't advance again. Okay, so assuming it's within this sort of time period when you're most likely to have kids based on the stage of your life you're at, and for women fertility, perhaps at the master's stage, here you really don't have that career stability, you might miss social opportunities, very short period of time, usually 1 or 2 years, some financial instability, so it might not be ideal. PhD, again, you might miss social and professional opportunities, fewer travel opportunities, high work demands, low salary and lack of benefits in many countries. Postdoc level, you then have this real job insecurity where you're working on these short-term contracts, and you're expected to be very productive so that you can get those fellowships, get those grants, get your independence. And then as a PI, you now have lab demands, funding pressures, promotion pressures. You want to take maternity leave, but there's so many people reliant on you that it becomes, not a great stage either. So what does the evidence say? Well, so I'm taking some evidence from this book, Do Babies Matter? Gender and Family in the Ivory Tower. And I wanted to sort of speak fairly gender neutral because, it's both, everybody can take parental leave. But in fact, the evidence does show that women do tend to take the bigger hit. So unfortunately, at every stage, there's this so-called baby penalty. One of the authors here says family negatively affects women's but not men's early academic careers. And women who advance through the faculty ranks have historically paid a considerable price for doing so in the form of much lower rates of family formation, fertility, higher rates of family dissolution. And for men, however, the pattern has been either neutral or even net positive. So this is based on, I think, 25 years of research across all academic disciplines. And these are the sorts of conclusions that they came to. So looking at this evidence, it seems that at the graduate student level, many students, when they have kids at this level, drop out because they view academia to be not actually very family friendly. They have these perceived ideas of time pressure, that they won't be taken seriously because they have all of these other responsibilities. At the postdoc level, around 40% of postdocs with children are contemplating leaving academia, and that's double what it is for postdocs who don't have children. So again, there seems to be a feeling of pressure at that level. And for PIs, 12 years post-PhD, 44% of female tenure professors are married with children, and that's compared to 70% of male. So again, it's this penalty that seems to be quite specifically for women. So when did I decide to have babies? Thankfully, I hadn't read this book yet, so I just went ahead. And this was the plan, do my undergraduate. I knew fairly quickly that I wanted to do more studying, so I would get some experience, then do a PhD. Postdoc 1, then maybe have a baby. Postdoc 2, have another baby, become a PI. That's the plan. And then, of course, there's actual life. It took a while for me to get a PhD place. I didn't do a master's. I just acquired some lab experience as research assistant and internships. At the end of my PhD, I ran out of funding, so I took a full-time job as a statistician for the government. At the same time, got married, moved to Australia for my first postdoc. Got a bit of illness in my first postdoc, and then ended up moving back to the UK, mainly to be closer to my family. That's where I did the second postdoc at the University of Oxford. And then that was when baby 1 came along. So had a baby there. The postdoc, that first postdoc in Oxford, the lab was really not a very good fit for me. At the same time, I had a family illness and a death. And all of this sort of transpired in a lot of mental health problems. So problems with depression and anxiety that unfortunately I took a very long time to actually get treated. Now I have. And then came, trying for the next baby, had a miscarriage in between there. And really this is all just to illustrate. So now I'm in a really great lab in my third postdoc. I'm not a PI, and I'm 8 months pregnant at the moment. So second baby's on the way. But this really is to illustrate that all of this stuff happened that I didn't plan on. And in many ways I was very lucky because it didn't take me a long time to get pregnant. You know, I have colleagues who it's taken years, friends who, you know, they've had to go through years and years of IVF. So the idea that it could, you know, this baby would just slot into this specific time period within a career is, you know, it's very optimistic to say the least, and you have to be very, very lucky. I mean, for some people it works that way, but you know, there's a lot of things that can happen in your life, and that can derail those plans. Of course, there's now a global pandemic, so I certainly did not plan to have a baby within a pandemic either. And so, yeah, really, it's just about acknowledging that it's going to be. It's not always going to go to plan, but it does work out. So I really bring up this: should you plan your career? Should you plan your life around a career that has no guarantees? Again, we have these statistics showing a lot of people end up leaving academia. And so if you're trying to plan when on that academic career path to have kids, it's worth thinking about, will I actually get that end goal? I mean, realistically, should I be basing my life around a goal that's not guaranteed? So what is the solution? Is it to just not have any kids? Of course not. I think it's really to, there's two things that you can do. One is to try to actively change the system, and one is to empower yourself by getting as much information as possible. So just starting practically, what are your parental leave rights? What does your workplace provide? Do they have breastfeeding rooms? Do they offer shared parental leave? How will you be supported financially? Will you have, you know, does your funder provide an extension of your grant or your fellowship? Do they provide assistance? Does somebody come in to cover your parental leave? Are there nurseries in your area? How much do they cost? Are there tax incentives? How long are the waiting lists? These are all practical things that you can work out. For example, in Oxford, I had to put myself down in a waiting list when I was 3 months pregnant, and 16 months later, I got a place at nursery. And of course, until I have that place in nursery, I can't return to work. So these are things that you can do to practically get yourself ready, regardless of when you decide or when you have a baby. And then also seek funding that allows for these career disruptions that are becoming increasingly more common. And if funders don't provide it, then challenge them, because, you know, there should be accountability for parental duties. When you actually do have a baby, this is a picture of me chairing an OHBM student postdoc SIG event actually in Singapore. I didn't ask for permission, I just brought my little one along. My husband was traveling for work, so I didn't have much of a choice, and I thought, rather than ask permission, I'll just do it, because if I ask permission, people will say, oh, it's going to disrupt the session, you know, there's no children allowed. I thought, just come up to me and tell me off if that's the case. And I do that for a lot of things. I've taken my little one to lab meetings, to conferences, to social events. And acknowledge that your priorities and your productivity might change, or they might not. It's very hard to predict how you will react when you have kids. I initially thought I'd take 4 months of maternity leave, and ended up actually taking 6 months, because I just couldn't bear to leave after 4 months. And then my husband did some shared parental. So those things are quite hard to predict. One of my mentors actually gave me a great bit of advice, which is to always overestimate how long you'll take for parental leave. And then you said you don't set an expectation, basically. So if you come back earlier, that's fine, but you, I guess, feel less guilty about, you know, disrupting things. And also just be flexible. So if you're like me, where you plan things and organize things and schedule things, you realize quite quickly that that all goes out the window, and travel plans are gone, baby gets sick, you know, things just, you just have to be flexible. And then finally, just do what works for you. People have very different tolerances for things. This picture of me with the baby, in some ways, I think maybe I set an expectation for people that they think they should bring their kids to conferences, and that should be really easy to do. I just happen to have a kid that slept really well in that, so she did okay. But I know that it might be a real struggle for other people. So it's not to say that this is something you should do, but it's something you can do if you want to. And then I just want to talk a little bit about, should we really be asking these questions and adapting ourselves to academia? And I really think that we should be trying as much as we can to change the system. I know personally, and for a lot of people, OHBM, the highlights really are the work of the Open Science SIG and of the student and postdoc SIG. And that's really, I think, because both groups are just driving change, and they're really driving cultural change, and it's like, enough is enough. And I think that's really great. So I think this kind of future, it gives me a lot of hope for the next generation of scientists. And we know that the publish and perish model is ridiculous and stupid. It excludes people with caring responsibilities, chronic illnesses, people who just want a better life balance, people who want high quality, reproducible work, and just bad luck. So if you've had personal bad luck or your experiments haven't worked out, it's crazy to think that you would be judged as a scientist just because you haven't output a load of papers that might have been, dodgy anyway. And of course, it then erodes confidence in the evidence, wastes precious resources, it stalls genuine advances, it rewards bad practice, and it often pushes out the best researchers, because some people think, the system's not going to change, I don't want to be a part of it, so they leave. And that's really a detriment to science. So what do we need? Well, we need to have more support for parents to ensure continuity of projects. And that's not just in terms of productivity, but practically, if experiments have been set up, clinical trials have been set up, things like that. If people go on parental leave, there should be some support. I know in Australia, for example, there's grants that you can get to cover a lab manager or a technician while you're away on parental leave, so that that work can continue. We also need to have shared parental leave more normalized, because in an institution I was in, for example, there was only 5% of fathers were taking up shared parental leave. So once that starts to balance up a little bit more, you'll have less gender disparities. And then we really need genuine teamwork. So I think we still reward individuals. All of these awards are always, to an individual person. Well, we know science is done as teams. And the problem with that then is that if I take leave, parental leave, then if I leave my work to somebody else, then I have to worry that, okay, they're going to then publish it, and now I'm going to have less output later on. And that's a crazy way to think. It should be like, this work needs to be done, it's done as a team. We shouldn't be judged as individuals so much. One really positive thing post-pandemic would be to keep these online meetings, which generally are more accessible, and the same for conferences and speaking opportunities. I'm 8 months pregnant, so I wouldn't have gone to Montreal. I'm also trying to reduce my flying. So the fact that this is online has actually given me an opportunity to speak, which is really great. And then just what Alex was mentioning about mentoring is that, seek multiple mentors. You don't just need to have one. You get lots of different perspectives. You can join the SIG's online mentoring scheme. I was really proud to be part of creating that, and it just seems to have gone from strength to strength. And then if there's parental groups at your institute, it's a really good way to connect with people who are going through similar things and who might have, tips for you. But I've spoken a bit about how to sort of change the system, but that's not terribly helpful if, for example, you're pregnant right now, or you are due to have a kid soon. You need some tips for right now. So just keep records. So how much maternity leave did you take, or paternity leave, parental leave did you take? Did you have extra appointments? Sometimes with IVF, this is an issue. Just keep records of those things. If you work part-time, calculate your full-time equivalent. So if you're only working half of the time, then your productivity, of course, halves. And so you need to make people aware of that if you're applying for funding or fellowships or grants. Adjust the numbers of years working post-PhD. So if you're 7 years post-PhD, you took a year of maternity or parental leave, then you're equivalent to 6 years. And that's very important for eligibility criteria and also for these productivity calculations, which unfortunately at the moment we still have to do. Calculate your productivity yourself. So don't leave somebody else to figure that out for you. And I've been on panels where I've seen that people don't really adjust for it. And they also adjust in a very weird way that's like, she took like 6 months maternity leave, so that it's not really that long, wouldn't really affect the number of papers. But of course, after maternity leave, you're still looking after a child, so your productivity is still going to be affected. You might be working part-time. So just calculate that for yourself so that it's clear as day for a reviewer. And then don't hide it, put it front and center in your CV. It's like the third line on my CV. This is when I was not available and this is how it's affected me. And then just kind of echoing some of the things that Alex said, actually, is just do at least one thing every day that brings you genuine pleasure. I completely agree with that. It's something that took me a long time to do, but now I try to do it every single day. It doesn't have to be a big thing, just one thing. And it can't be, as I used to think, I submitted an abstract, I get pleasure from the fact that that's done. That does not count, because the actual process of submitting the abstract is not pleasurable. It has to be something you genuinely take pleasure out of, whether it's like eating something or, doing some gardening or some sport, whatever. Try to do it in a mindful way as well. And don't be seduced by prestige, whether that's of universities or of people. Sometimes you want to work with the famous professor. Just work with people who are good and kind, and your life will be much better for it. And again, echoing what Alex has said, is that defines what success looks like for you. Like, we have this vision of success that it's a prof at a prestigious university with this fellowship and this grant, and that might not be what it is for you. Maybe it's just having weekends free to be with your family, doing things that you like, teaching, whatever combination of things makes you happy should be your aim of success. And thank you. This is a picture of my daughter who has mastered the art of doing things just for pleasure, as most kids have. And so I think we can learn a lot from that. And let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you.
very
That was
much.
amazing. I just wanted to say thank you for just talking about all of these things and really normalizing having these conversations, because it's not something that's typical in academia. So I really appreciate that. So again, we're running a few minutes late, but I'll jump in with some questions that are in the chat. So how did you manage or arrange all of the moving, like doing postdocs in different countries with your partner?
Yeah, that was very difficult, actually. So Singapore, I was alone. My partner was away. Again, this also speaks to privilege, and something that I really dislike in academia is this idea that you have to move around the world, because I was in a financial position to be able to do that to a certain extent, but most of it was, on my own. Australia, we managed to move together. He's not an academic, so he was able to just get other jobs, but I'm aware the two-body problem can be a real issue. And I do think there should be less emphasis on all of these international positions and things. Anything else?
So we have one other question in the chat. So this is a question about how do you disclose or tell a prospective employer that you're planning to hopefully get pregnant like early into the new position? Or like, do you suggest waiting until it happens and then dealing with it?
Yeah, this is a very tricky one, I have to say. It's very difficult because I'm aware that there's a massive bias, that some people will find this very off-putting, which is terrible, and you have to question if it's the sort of lab you'll want to be in, if you have to hide that sort of thing. For example, the lab I'm in now, my PI has just hired somebody who's who's going on maternity leave at the same time as me, and who was heavily pregnant in our interview. And so she's not going to be able to join the lab for however long her maternity leave is. And that was fine, because he was like, this is a good candidate and I want her to join the lab, so we'll make adjustments for that. So yeah, I think personally I have to question whether I want to be in an environment where this is something that I can't openly disclose.
Great, that's very helpful. So we'll move on to Amy, and then we'll do more questions at the end when we have time for them.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
I'm just grabbing my screen. Okay, you guys see that?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so I just want to start by saying thank you to the OHBM Postdoc and SIG group for inviting me to talk today. And I feel like Michelle and Alex basically took the words out of my mouth. A lot of the things that I'm going to be saying are kind of repeated, but hopefully said in a slightly different way that might be helpful. And so I want to start by saying, obviously, that everyone is different. And so kind of echoing what Michelle was saying, what works for me might not work for you. So today I'm just going to share tips on what has worked for me, and hopefully you can kind of take what you need from it and apply it in your own life, or try applying it in your own life. The other thing I want to echo is that, of course, I also come from a place of relative privilege. I am from a very kind of poor rural area in the U.S. I was lucky enough to have really great parents, but my high school, for example, did not have calculus or trigonometry. Ended up getting my PhD in math, so that was kind of fun. But I came from a very kind of rural and poor background. So that's kind of a little bit of not privilege, but the rest is, I have the things that come with most privilege. So I want to say that things that work for me might not work for everyone. And of course, the timeline I will present now will show that, the work-life balance changes over time as well. So as a PhD student, of course, it usually for everyone looks a little like this. I want to get into that later, actually, about how it doesn't always have to be like that. But, continuing postdoc, assistant professor, early career, similar type of balance where I have a little bit more work than life. And then, of course, when I had my first child, I definitely tipped the scales towards life. Work took a backseat for that first few months. And talking about maternity leave, actually, it's kind of sad because the US is actually one of the only countries that doesn't guarantee any maternity leave. And so I was actually privileged enough to have maternity leave in the US, at least a little bit, 12 weeks. Okay, so then after a few months, actually a year or so, I was able to get back on that balance, become associate professor, everything's going well. And then I have my second child. So then the balance swings back to life, which is fine. And then we have, sorry, I just had to move my Zoom call there. Then we have a nice balance again. Oh, starting 2019, everything's really nicely balanced. And then of course the pandemic hits. So that's when my kind of balance just becomes a complete disaster, and work and life are both overwhelming each other and bending that into a little frowny face. So yeah, so this is kind of the timeline that we have. Hopefully in the future we will get back to something that is more level, but this is where we are right now. Okay, so now I wanted to do a little poll. Let me see if I can pull that up. Oh, okay, she's gonna do that.
Yep.
Okay, so how many hours per week do you work? And do you work weekends? And how much vacation time do you take per year? So go ahead and start, you guys can start filling that in. And as you guys answer those questions, what I have circled there are not the correct answers, but they are my answers. And I generally work probably 45 to 55 hours of paid work. So it's a very, there's a distinction there. So on my paid work, that's usually where I am in that range. I rarely work weekends now. I used to work them a bit more, but now that I have children, I really focus on trying to keep my weekends for my family, and I really only work them if I have a deadline approaching. And then vacation time, of course, in the US, it's abysmal, and there's 0 vacation time that's guaranteed. Again, I'm lucky enough to work at an institution that gives me about 5 weeks of vacation, and I generally take 3 or 4 of them. I did use a lot of it for supplementing my maternity leave, which is another sad state of affairs, but that's just how it works, I guess, in the US for now. Hopefully that will change soon. Okay, so let's look at the results. I think most people have voted. Yeah, 86%, that's pretty good. Okay, so I'm gonna end the poll and I'm gonna share results. So let's see. So yeah, it's a pretty even split between 35 to 45 and 45 to 55. So that's great. That's I think that's a pretty reasonable amount. 4 of you are working greater than 65 hours a week. God bless you. And do you work weekends? Sometimes, yeah. Okay, so that's good. Sometimes, always, rarely. That's interesting. And then how much vacation time do you take per year? Yeah. So I'm guessing a lot of you are students, and I think, I guess you don't really get vacations. Is that how it works? I guess that's mostly probably what that is. Okay. All right. So, all right, let me just cross out of that. Okay. All right. So I already kind of went over my answers to the questions. So now let's all rewind to those golden days of December 2019. Where we didn't have to deal with pandemics and wearing masks all the time. So this is the advice that I would have given you in December of 2019. So a lot of these things are kind of echoing what Alex was saying and Michelle were saying, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But one thing that I want to focus on is optimizing meetings. So everybody in my lab probably knows that I really despise meetings mostly. I like them when I have them, but I really try to minimize them because a lot of times they're not helpful. So we try to minimize the length of them. Defaulting to 30 minutes when you schedule them is a little bit better than defaulting to the general hour, because then it gives people some extra chit chat time, which isn't so bad either. But trying to focus in on really getting what you want to get done, having a clear agenda and objectives for your meetings, and then also have visuals of whatever you want to present. The other thing I like to do is protect chunks of productive time. So I have my meetings that I sort of try to schedule back to back so that I can have these uninterrupted times where I can get a lot done. If you have an office, closing the door is helpful. And then, of course, Alex was touching on this as well, as try to leave the social media alone, turn off your notifications. I also do the same thing Alex does, where I don't have any notifications on my phone except text messages and phone calls. There's also software that can keep you on track if you can't do it yourself. There's software that can block those sites for you. And then, of course, when you're at work. So organize, again, what Alex was saying, kind of prioritize your lists and put due dates on them, and I usually create either a daily or weekly, sometimes monthly goals. I write them down, and it's so satisfying when I check them off my list. I have like a done list, and I take them, I copy paste them over, and I'm like, oh, okay, it just keeps getting longer and longer. So it's kind of helpful with that. And then I try to divide my daily activities by doing deep thinking things in the morning right after I have my coffee. Usually that really helps. And doing my medium thinking things like review of papers or grants, doing other types of paperwork, editing, and my deep thinking sort of grant proposals and experiments design in the morning. And then this is something that I took, it was actually kind of a hard lesson for me. Taking care in the moment can actually save a lot of time in the long run. So if you think that you're spending too much time on something in the moment, a lot of times it will actually save you future work. So I had this little cartoon that somebody sent in our Slack channel that I thought was pretty funny. Describes a lot of people in our lab, actually. All right, so when you're at work again, find a lab or a department that supports your choices. So I also yesterday was scrolling through the I think it was like PhD student subreddit or something, and it was so depressing because it was just like everybody was talking about this culture of overwork, and kind of like some people were bragging about it, some people were saying it was stupid. you know, you have to find a lab that supports your choices. So if you want to work 65 hours a week, and you can do that without burning out, then I think that you should find a lab that supports that choice. If it's something that you can't do, like me, then you need to find a lab or a PI that can support your choices, and be unapologetic about it. Don't, you know, people revere these people who say that they work all the time, but there's also should be some credit given to people who also balance their work and life. So again, PIs are people too. This is a theme that I want to emphasize throughout my work, is to talk to your PI. Don't think that there's some, you know, person that's far away from you and that won't understand what you're going through. We've gone through a lot of those same things, so just talk to us. And the other thing, of course, is delegate and ask for help. And then I know that my lab is going to think that I am totally hypocritical for saying this, just say no. I want other people to do it. I have trouble doing it myself. I really think that it's a good thing to integrate into your life, but I also have trouble saying this. So I say just say no, but I also know that it's hard to do sometimes. Okay, when you're at home. Okay, put down the device. Just enjoy the people around you. Try not to think about work. So put your device away, turn off your email, turn off your Slack, tell your lab when you're not going to be available, so that they know that you might be delayed in responding. Another thing that was really helpful when I was a PhD student was scheduling regularly occurring social events that I would feel bad about canceling. So that you force yourself to get out and enjoy being with other people. So I think we did like Top Chef nights where we rotated around and we watched Top Chef and everybody cooked for each other. So it's kind of like this regularly occurring event that you can enjoy being and enjoy your life. So again, delegate in your home life as well. Ask for help. If you can afford it, outsource your housework. If you can't, try to get your partner or your in-laws or your parents to help. This is also very helpful. And one of the reasons why I moved to Ithaca from New York City was so that I could be closer to my family. You know, it's kind of a route that most people don't take, but it worked for me. And so I asked for it. So you'd be surprised with, you know, what you can actually get if you ask for it. And then this last one is, it can't be emphasized more, is to find a partner or family that supports your choices as well. Okay, so vacations, take them. Please take them. They really help you to revitalize yourself, to come back to work with fresh eyes, totally disconnect. So usually at least the first half of my vacation, I don't even check my email at all. I turn it off. You know, I say that coming from a job that allows me to have 5 weeks of vacation. Obviously, not everybody is so lucky, especially in the US where you have 0 required yearly time off. It's very depressing. But what I want to emphasize here is that even that if it's 0 or you get 1 or 2 weeks per year as a PhD student or postdoc, just ask your PI. If you want to take a vacation, we understand. We want you to be happy. So if you need to take a break and you need to take a vacation, just ask, you know, work around the system. If you can't if the system is not set up for you, then try to find ways around it. That's kind of what I want to emphasize there. And then also self-care. So definitely pay attention to your mental health and get what you need. If you realize that you're starting to get burned out, if you're starting to feel like you're overwhelmed, take a break, ask for help, take leave, talk to your PI, tell them how you're feeling. They want you to be happy. Also the general things, exercise, sleep, and food. Get outside. This is a great thing for everyone right now. Hopefully you can get outside if you're not living in the city. And then these last couple of things, brain candy. So I know that I've said this a couple times in my lab, but I usually have like a novel or some stupid TV show that allows me to completely take a break and activate different parts of my brain by watching and completely remove myself from work. So it helps you kind of separate those two. The other thing that I found kind of helpful was this wall of happy idea, which is to print out some pictures of times in your life that you've been most happy, put them in a prominent spot in your house. So every time you walk past, you can kind of look at them and get like this nice happy feeling. That really helps as well. And that can apply to your desk at work as well. And of course, this is another good thing for time passing. Right now in the pandemic, it's passing very strangely for a lot of people. The days are not very demarked, and so sometimes it feels like time is going very slowly. But one thing you can try to do to get out of it is try different things and try new things, and it helps your time pass a little bit with more joy. Okay, so a little bit about kids. Good luck. My colleague once told me when I was, it was my first child, I was about to give birth, and he's like, "Oh, you're gonna be hit by the child truck soon." And I was like, I don't really know what this guy's talking about, but I'll be fine. It was pretty accurate, I would say. So it was a very big change for me. Some people, they find it very easy. For me, it was very difficult. I was terrified I was gonna drop the baby for like the first 6 weeks of my life, of my child's life. And I want to emphasize again, if you have parental leave, take what you need. Like Michele said, overestimate the amount of time that you're going to take for it. If you're in the US, again, try to find an institution or a university or a department that will support your choices. I actually had 12 weeks of protected leave, which means that I wouldn't lose my job for 12 weeks, but I don't necessarily have to be paid for them. So I was fortunate enough to be with an institution where they pay 6 weeks, and they don't pay the last 6, but I took my vacation for it. So I ended up getting basically 3 months of paid leave. And that actually changed with my second child. They just now have increased the amount of parental leave for both dads and moms for 8 weeks of paid leave. So that's actually kind of a nice thing that happened right when I had my second child. So it was really good timing on that case. And the other thing is parenting as a scientist. I don't know if anyone else has tried to do this, but there are no patterns. Don't try to find them. Like if you're like, oh, I gave them spaghetti and they had like the best night of sleep. It is not a pattern. Don't try it. You're going to drive yourself insane. So yeah, don't try to find any patterns. And then when all else fails, there's always coffee. So don't worry. That will always be there for you. And I wanted to emphasize the amount of work that a child is. So I didn't really kind of have, I had like a vague concept that I knew that having a child was going to increase my workload, but I did not know the quantification of it. And this is actually a pretty realistic study that was very on point for me, where they did a study of a survey. Of course, there's only 185 respondents, so it's a little bit biased, I'm sure. And it was performed 9 months after the baby was born. And for women, they went from working 56 hours a week to working 77 hours a week in both unpaid and paid work. And just to reiterate, this is equivalent to 2 full-time jobs, just to reiterate. So know what you're getting into when you have a child, and be gentle with yourself. If your productivity goes down, it's okay. You have a child now. It's all right to split that time. And another unfortunate thing, also kind of echoing what Michele was saying, is that oftentimes there's an imbalance in the amount of increase of work. So these were actually partners that were both working and had full-time jobs. And as you can see, there is this imbalance of 77 versus 69 hours, which is equivalent to a gender gap of 3 weeks per year of working 24-hour days. So that's something to keep in mind when you're having a child, so that you come with open eyes. Okay, so now, post-pandemic advice on work-life balance. Yeah, working from home. Okay, so is it working from home or living at work? This is the best question I had to ask me. So it's a little bit tough to work from home for some people. For others, there are some benefits. And I think when we come back from this post-pandemic world, we may see a little bit different work-life, working from home balance. So I think that since we have this shift, we need to focus on like what can help be productive at home. But first I want to emphasize, do what you need to survive, let the rest go. So it's unprecedented times. Do what you need to do to get yourself through with intact mental health, and let the rest go. Again, talk to your PI. If you're feeling depressed and anxious and have like stresses about family, just talk to your PI. They want you to be happy. They want to help you. If they don't, then you need to leave. And there's this last quote that I kept telling myself in those early days of newborn stages, where I was getting like 40 minutes of sleep in chunks. Just keep going, just keep swimming, get through it. This won't last forever. This too shall pass. Okay, so work from home, a little bit of tips on that is to basically try to separate work and personal time. If you have like a corner, or if you're lucky enough an office, or if you have a desk, an area maybe you can set up in your apartment to kind of try to separate work and personal time. People were talking about doing like a virtual commute where you have, if you usually listen to music, maybe you can put music on as you walk to your desk, or I usually separate it by having my second cup of coffee and try to kind of get that mentality for work. It's not the time for busy work. So focus on your most important things, get those done. Keep clearly defined work hours. So I understand that also having children during a pandemic, you need to be flexible, but I try to at least have times at which I usually work and try not to let it leak into other areas, although that's a little bit difficult. This is also something that's really helping my mental health, is minimizing news breaks. So I don't know about all of you, but I can't read the news much anymore. It's driving me crazy. So I think one of the things is just to minimize it, maybe just to once a day. And then to stay connected with coworkers. So here I have our lab photo of our journal club we were having the other day with some people photoshopped in. But staying connected with coworkers has really helped. We've had a couple of times like a lab happy hour. We have a Slack channel for like chit chat and for questions, icebreaker questions, getting to know each other, because we have some new people that have started in our lab since the pandemic, and we don't really have that physical proximity to them to get to know them. So having this chit chat channels usually helps too. The other thing I wanted to emphasize is I actually Googled PIs are people too, and this came up. There's an actual article in Nature about how PIs are people too. So we want you to be happy. We've often had the same struggles. And again, echoing what Alex said, we don't always have everything figured out. So be gentle with us as well. It's a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. Your work-life balance may change over time. So ask for what you need, and hopefully you can get it. If you can't get it, just keep working until you find something that works for you. Okay, the other kind of things I wanted to finish with is work-life balance doesn't have to wait until you have a child, until you're done with this next publication, until you're done with this grant proposal. I made that mistake early on in my career where I was like, I'll just work really crazy hours until I have a child, and then I'll go balance. But I did that a little bit, but I think it was probably the wrong way to be, because I think I started to have signs of burnout early on in my career. So I think that it's important to try to strive for that work-life balance that works for you early on in your career, and make it a consistent thing that you're striving for. And again, I just want to echo, just ask. So I've gotten 3 jobs, admission to a PhD program, and my current remote work situation by just asking. So just because somebody hasn't done it before doesn't mean that you can't do it. If it's something that you really want, just try to make it work. And try to keep trying. And that's the other thing I wanted to emphasize. If it doesn't work for you, then try something different. And then the last I wanted to end on, and I've shared this before with my lab mates, my students as well, is that the imposter syndrome is real. I still suffer from it today. And I wanted to show you this really horrible quote I had from one of my grant proposals early on in my career, when I was a postdoc. This is actually the first early career grant that I applied for. And this was the response that I got back. So I want to emphasize that it's okay to, it's not okay. It's not okay to get this horrible sort of feedback, but you can recover from it and let it wash off your back. So take the things that are useful and let the rest kind of bounce off of you, and keep trying. All right, and I want to end just with this kind of anecdote to echo actually what both Michele and Alex said. So this was a really interesting letter that was shared with me by a colleague of mine about Richard Feynman. So he had just won the Nobel Prize, and one of his former students had written him a letter to congratulate him. And Feynman was asking him, what are you working on? Where are you? And the student wrote back, I'm a nameless man and I work on humble problems, kind of trying to basically just downplaying his role in science. And it made Feynman actually very sad. And he basically was saying that, a problem is grand if it lies before you unsolved and you can see some way to make headway. So if you can actually work on a problem and make progress in it, then you should feel good about that. And he, you know, as far as the student saying he was a nameless man, he said, "You are not to your wife and child. You will not remain so to your immediate colleagues if you can answer their simple questions when they come to your office. You are not nameless to me. Do not remain nameless to yourself. It's too sad a way to be." So essentially what I want to emphasize here is don't let society or your PI dictate what you find worthy, and do what works for you. Find meaning in it. And if it means not winning the Nobel Prize, if I can be at home every night to read to my children, then I'm fine with that. So I knew that going in that, you know, my work-life balance might mean that I might not get as many professional successes as my colleagues, but I was totally fine with that. Okay, and that's all. Thank you.
Yay!
Thank you. That was great. I'm gonna quickly jump in and ask a question from the chat because I know you have another call you need to get to. So what was the largest pushback you experienced in trying to adapt your work to your life?
Oh, maybe this shows my this kind of selectivity bias, but I don't really think that I had much pushback. Maybe I did and I didn't realize it. Yeah, I think that maybe it's my personality to like ignore setbacks and just keep going and like work around them. And if somebody's like a negative person, I kind of ignore that. I mean, I've had a few comments from colleagues that were not like the most that were kind of hurtful at times. But I tend to try to ignore those. I don't know if that's good or bad, but I generally try to ignore those.
Thank you. So we are at the end of our session. If people need to leave, feel free to do so. If any of the speakers are able to stay on for a few more minutes, we do have a few other questions. But I'd just like to say thank you to all of you for joining, and thank you so much to all the speakers for taking time out of your day to be a part of this. I know I really appreciated it, and I'm sure everyone else, we really learn a lot because it's learning from people like you that are our inspirations and our role models that we can really learn how to be the best versions of ourselves as scientists and also as people.
Yeah, echoing that. Thank you so much. Awkward, quiet clap. It's a new thing.
Could I ask a question? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
So I'm also have the pleasure of working with Amy. So I'm kind of asking this question more for other people than myself, but because I was in a lab where the work-life balance was very poor. Saturdays were mandatory. If you're coming in 9 to 5, that wasn't enough. And so I had that conversation very early on with Amy about burnout and her thoughts, and everything checked out, so I joined. But what advice do any of the panelists have for a student who might be in a situation or in a lab where they don't feel supported in having work-life balance?
So I will give you a little tidbit. As when I was a PhD student, I had this kind of exact situation. And I guess my advice to myself back then would have been to do what you can and get out. I guess is if there's no other option for you to transfer or to switch but you can tolerate it for a short period of time, however long it takes you to complete it, just kind of bite the bullet and do the minimum amount possible to get you know, what you need out of that lab. I think that's probably what I would have said to myself back then. But the first thing is to try and transfer if you can. If it's something that you can't deal with, then definitely try to change your situation. But if it's something that you can deal with for a short period of time, then kind of like try to stick it out, I would say.
I agree. I think also if you can, before you join labs, do try and talk to PhD students and postdocs. I was in a really bad lab before, and now people do still contact me to ask me what the culture was like. And, you know, I have a phone call with them and just tell them, and it's up to them if it's something they can put it up with. But you know, for me, it was wrong, and as soon as I could, I got out of there.
Yeah, I remember actually interviewing, I went for, as a prospective graduate student, to a place in a university to kind of visit, and everyone was miserable. Like the PhDs, they were complaining the entire time. And I was like, oh, that's a red flag. I'm not gonna go here. So it's just, you know, this really horrible culture of overwork and just no pleasure in life. And it was just, yeah, it was no good.
You can also sort of tell by ongoing relationships. So bad labs have very high turnover, and a lot of, like the lab I'm in currently, a lot of the people who've worked with my PI still work with him. So, you know, because, and the same thing for my first postdoc, actually, these long relationships, it tells you that, you know, it's a good person to work with.
I'll just add, you know, any potential position is a two-way interview. You know, obviously the PI is interviewing you, but you know, you got to make sure that you're going to be happy going into that workplace. And it's definitely important to ask if you can speak to lab members. And if the PI is reluctant to do that, then that says a lot.
Thank you all.
So I'm going to jump in with a question that someone had for Alex. So they said that they've tried these ideas of an accountability partner, but they felt that they were too lax with each other. So how do you counter that, and how do you avoid that?
I think you have to build in structures and kind of you know, place the responsibility on the system. So, you know, it's perfectly fine to acknowledge, okay, this is not working, let's reinvent it. And then I mean, obviously it's going to be tailored to your specific situation, but then there has to be a consequence that hurts if you're not going to stick to it, right? You have to have skin in the game for it to be meaningful. And that's going to, you know, I mean, that's going to vary for different people. But, you know, I mean, there's no, I mean, another way to look at it is, why would you do this if you're not going to be serious about it? What's the point of wasting everyone's time, right? So I think you both need to agree that, okay, we're going to treat it seriously. This is how we're putting skin in the game. This is what's going to happen if we don't follow through, and run with it. But you both do have to be committed to the process.
I think there was an interesting podcast I was listening to about accountability, and they were basically, I think somebody was trying to quit smoking, and they basically gave like $500 to someone, a third party, and they said, if I don't stop smoking by this point, you can give it to like this horrible political cause that I hate. So it was actually like trying to make skin in the game. So if that is what you need to do, then maybe that's a good approach.
So we have one other question that probably all of the panelists can answer. So how would you handle like snide comments or remarks from your supervisor or potentially other people about second work or hobbies outside of academia if they're saying that they're supportive, but their actions don't necessarily support that?
I mean, I think you could call them out on it, right? Like if they make a snarky comment, you just be like, I'm sorry, do you think that's wrong or whatever? And I'm sure you'll see their back stiffen up and they'll backtrack. But yeah, or I mean, you know, the flip side is if it's just some snarky thing, to ignore it. Usually when people make those comments, it's more about them than it says anything about you. So don't get caught up in other people's misery that they're jealous just because you've got something in your life that's outside of work. But yeah, I mean, yeah, sometimes it can be hard in the moment when someone says something to be on top of it and say, oh, but, look, I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with, even if it is the next day where it's kind of played on your mind, you can say, look, yesterday you made that comment, just wanted to clarify, what did you mean by that? You know, usually a conversation is the best way to deal with these things.
I think it also helps to try to foster in your lab a sort of culture where that is unacceptable, and where a lot of, sometimes you get stuck. And when I was in a sort of more toxic lab, I felt that people were stuck in the same mentality where it was like you didn't talk about things outside that you were doing. You just sort of talked about how much you were working, or you spent your weekend working, you haven't had any holiday, and it just sort of perpetuates itself. And then you don't want to be the person who's like, oh, actually I took 2 weeks off, I haven't worked a weekend for like a year, because then you feel like, you know, somehow you're not working as hard as everybody else. So if you can, within the rest of the lab, try to foster a culture that is more, you know, accepting of these sorts of things. And also, I mean, it's super boring if all you ever talk about is work, right? Like, you want to come in and talk to your lab mates about stuff that you did on the weekend, or your interests and things like that. And the more you can sort of get that culture going, the less acceptable it comes when somebody's being snarky about these sorts of things.
Okay, sorry, I have to run now to this other talk. But thank you everybody for that. Was a great session. It was great to hear it for myself as well. So, all right, thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
So there's one other question here that was for Michele, if I can find it. So how did you mentioned sort of accounting for maternity leave when calculating your number of hours and things like that. So how did you actually go about doing that? Is there a formal way of bringing that up in an application? So they talk about a specific grant application where that wasn't allowed, and how do you sort of navigate that whole field?
Yeah, that's very, it's awful that these things are still not allowed. I mean, I guess one way to do it is just calculate it, and then if they question it, then you can push back, because, you know, it's just a reality. So I literally, if I've taken 6 months of maternity leave, then my calculation for where I am post PhD is, at the moment I'm 7 years post PhD, but if you add my maternity leave, I'm actually 6 years or 6.5 years. So I literally take that period of time, because it is time when I'm not working, and minus it, very simply. If you start to work part-time, then you can also calculate, I know some people, you work out your average number of publications for a year when there's no interruption, and then you essentially look at how many you have in your, that becomes a sort of measure of what your normal productivity is, I suppose. And so you can adjust for any periods of time where you weren't doing that. So people do it in various ways. Sometimes I've seen people just put on their full-time equivalent and allow the reviewer to make an adjustment for that. But I think if you can formally calculate it, if you Google it, there are a number of different ways, and maybe you find a way that suits either you or the application. But I do think it's very important to do it, because I don't think people properly account for it. They'll just sort of see it and think, oh, okay, well, you had slightly less time, or they don't even account for it at all. So as much as you can quantify it, do that. At least while we're so focused on these ridiculous metrics.
Great, thank you. I think there's one last question that I found in the chat. If there's anything I missed, Megan, feel free to jump in, by the way.
Yeah, I'm trying to find.
So there's a question for Alex. So you specifically talked about saying no, and I mean, you guys all talked about this. In terms of peer review or other activities where it's productive and it's like a great idea to give back to your community and get that experience, but it can also take a lot of time to complete. So how do you balance that in terms of saying yes to things that could help you, but also managing your no's?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think with peer review, my personal view is that, you know, it is something that's important. So my default tends to be a yes, unless I have a really compelling, you know, unless it's just a really bad time. You know, I mean, there are sometimes where I just get flooded with requests and it's just not possible, but I do try to take on as many as I can, but that's just a personal preference. You know, I think it just depends on your workload. If you feel like you can't take it on, then it's fine to say no. Most important thing I would say, though, you know, being an editor for a journal, is if you do say no, please provide suggestions for other reviewers, because that then helps us on the other end.
Some people have a formula of basically as many as you submit, so that you balance the system. So if you're unlucky, you get a lot of rejections, you got a lot of peer review on your hands, but, well, desk rejects don't count. So it's only peer reviewed as many as I've done for you.
I think that's all the questions.
Sorry, someone just sent me one more.
Okay.
So there's like you mentioned, having a baby and maternity leave is something that you put on your CV, like front and center. How do you now account for things that you necessarily can't put on your CV? So other unfortunate situations, illnesses, like family issues, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that one is actually really tricky. And I think there should be better standards for this. And, well, I mean, it all comes down to the fact that we shouldn't be accounting for every second of our lives in terms of productivity. That's the major issue. But if there are significant periods of your time, of your life, where you have to take chunks of time out, then I do think it should be on your CV to prevent people underestimating your output. Because the issue is that some people are lucky and don't have those, and then they look hyper productive relative to other people, and it's very hard for people not to award those hyper productive people, because when you see their CVs, it's difficult not to get out of the mentality of, well, they've just been really lucky. So I do think if there's a significant period of time where you are unable to work, that you account for it in some way on your CV, even if it's just a line, that there's a gap between things. That it doesn't, I don't think it harms to add it. You don't need necessarily a lot of detail, just have it, or even if it's in a cover letter, to say, you know, please account for the fact that I was unable to work during this period.
Thank you. Megan, is there anything else that I might have missed?
I'm muted. No, I don't think so. I think we've got all of them, unless there's more last minute ones. Yeah, that was such a great workshop, such a good breadth of different experiences, and yeah, wide-ranging advice. It's really helpful. I'm liking the learn to say no thing, and that everybody struggles with it as well, because I don't know how to say no.
Yeah, I guess we can end off on that. So once again, thank you so much to both of you for being a part of this. And I'd also like to acknowledge all of the people in the SIG that put in all of this hard work. So Hajar, Mangja, and also Amélie, they really did a lot in just coordinating all the speakers, figuring out, like, making sure this would work. And thanks everyone to really joining and contributing to these conversations.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks for organizing, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers, and we'll see you eventually in person post-pandemic.
Yeah.
One day.
Bye.
Cheers, bye.
Bye.